I'd like now to introduce the moderator for this plenary, Tommy Boudreau. I was fortunate enough to work with Tommy at the Department of Interior, where he served as Chief of Staff and the first Director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. Tommy is now a partner at Latham & Watkins and is a member of their Environment, Land, and Resources Department. So please join me in welcoming Tommy and the entire panel. Thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for the welcome, Chris, and congratulations to Chris and the National Marine Sanctuaries Foundation for another extremely successful and engaging Capitol Hill Ocean Week conference. I also want to thank the foundation staff for months of hard work preparing for this conference, and special thanks to Jackie McGarry for her assistance with this panel, the theme of which is Powering Our Future. This panel will explore the role of the ocean and the offshore as a source of energy to power our nation and economy into the future as demand for energy, including clean energy, continues to grow. Offshore energy has been a staple of the United States energy mix for decades. Until the last decade or so, offshore energy in North America has meant oil and gas development, most significantly on the shelf and in the deep water of the Gulf of Mexico. Offshore oil and gas remains a big part of the ocean energy conversation today. The Gulf of Mexico is one of the world's most prolific basins and supports an active offshore industry and a tremendous infrastructure, both offshore and onshore. A big part of the current policy discussion related to offshore oil and gas is whether, quote unquote, new areas, including in the Atlantic, should be open to seismic exploration to better understand geologic formations and to potential oil and gas leasing. While offshore wind power got a big head start in the North Sea, it has gained enormous momentum as a burgeoning industry and a source of renewable energy for North America. This is thanks in large part to the work of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, my former agency. Many of the staff is here, which I'm very excited to see, on the leasing side for offshore wind, as well as other federal partners, the offshore wind industry, a host of stakeholders, and critically now, the states along the Atlantic coast. Over the past couple of years, states such as Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Rhode Island, and Connecticut have established programs to acquire offshore wind power to help meet the state's ambitious renewable energy goals. Leasing also has occurred off of other East Coast states, such as Delaware, Virginia, and North Carolina, and is being actively considered in the Pacific, where floating offshore wind technology will be critical to deployment. There are also exciting emerging technologies such as wave and tidal, which are subject to very interesting R&D work right now. All of this is happening within a framing sometimes described as the blue economy, which the Energy Department described in its very recent report, Powering the Blue Economy, as expanding demand for ocean-derived food, materials, energy, and knowledge. Critically, in the context of the blue economy, is one of ever-increasing concern and focus on sustainability and climate. The challenges associated with looking to our oceans to help power our future are many, and include how to accommodate and reconcile these opportunities for energy development with important existing and traditional uses, such as economies related to fishing, tourism, the maritime activity, and of course, national defense. Protection for marine ecosystems, which are under increasing stress from a multitude of factors, and also how to work through partnerships to support good decision-making about offshore uses, including energy development that is based on robust science and community engagement. This afternoon, we have a truly wonderful panel of experts who have grappled with all of these issues throughout their careers. Together, they offer a deep and diverse experience that will help us all of us knit together these issues during what I expect will be a very enjoyable discussion. So it is my honor and my pleasure to briefly introduce each of our panelists joining us for this plenary. First, we have Director Alejandro Moreno, who is the head of the Water Power Technologies Office at the Energy Department's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. He manages efforts to develop and commercialize innovative technologies and market solutions for clean domestic power generation from hydropower and marine energy resources across the United States. It is Director Moreno's and his office who published the very timely Powering Our Blue Economy report that I commend to all of you. Next, we have Nancy Sopko. Nancy is the co-director of the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, which is an independent project at the University of Delaware's College of Earth, Ocean, and Environment that supports the advancement of offshore wind as part of a comprehensive solution to the most pressing energy problems facing the United States. Nancy was one of the very first ocean energy and conservation advocates I met when I joined the Interior Department. We've shared a lot of ideas and learned a great deal from each other over the years, and I appreciate Nancy joining this panel very much. Next, we have Kevin Knobloch. Kevin is the president of the New York Ocean Grid LLC, where he leads Amberic's efforts to develop offshore wind transmission in New York. He was previously a senior research fellow at the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy at Tufts, where he co-authored the report Clean Energy Policy and Expanding Markets. Kevin also served as Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Energy under Secretary Moniz and was president of the Union of Concerned Scientists for 10 years prior to that. It's safe to say Kevin will always be a concerned scientist. Also, as a former department chief of staff, as I am, he and I have a kinship that maybe only former residents of St. Elizabeth's can really appreciate. Tim Charters, our last panelist, is the Vice President for Government and Political Affairs at the National Ocean Industries Association. Tim's role at NOIA includes coordinating legislative, educational, and political activities for the association concerning offshore oil, natural gas, and wind energy resource issues. He was previously with the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Natural Resources for 6.5 years as staff director for the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources. And that's where I got to know Tim originally, was when he worked on the Hill, and I testified in front of his committee many, many times. Tim always gave those hearings a lot of thought and usually had a surprise or two waiting for me, and so we'll find out if I reciprocate. Thanks very much, everyone, and I turn it over to Director Moreno.
Thanks, Tommy, and thanks to Chris and the entire National Marine Sanctuaries Foundation for having us here and for having the department here. My name is Alejandro Moreno. I'm the director of the Water Power Technologies Office at the Department of Energy. As Tommy said, we cover all of the department's research in addition to hydropower, in all these emerging marine renewable energy technologies. And what that counts, just for context for us, is wave power, tidal power, ocean current power, what we call in-stream hydrokinetics, or anything that uses the unobstructed flow of water or movement of water to generate electricity. We're one of 4 offices within the department's renewable power division, along with wind power, geothermal, and solar. And we really sit sort of at the confluence of what Tommy nicely said was the blue economy and renewable energy, or the green economy, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I want to plant one seed. I'm going to talk a little bit, take a step back and talk a little bit about the department's broader role in the ocean, but one seed I want to plant with all of you for marine energy, as opposed to, for example, offshore wind, which actually for us is covered in our wind office, although we do a lot of joint work for obvious reasons. Marine energy really has the potential to have a dual role in the blue economy here. And one is, like offshore wind, it's a sector in its own right, like oil and gas. It is a big economic driver, a potentially large economic driver within the ocean. But the second is also as one of the only technologies that can generate power at sea, sustainable renewable power at sea, at a scale that is relevant for a lot of the emerging technologies at sea as part of the blue economy, that it has the potential to be a critical enabler of those technologies and those elements, sectors of the emerging blue economy that really are energy constrained. As we know, generating energy sustainably at sea, keeping it there is not necessarily the easiest thing. So before I go back to that seed that hopefully I planted, let me talk a little bit more about the department writ large. I also have the honor to be the department's representative on the Ocean Policy Council. And as such, I represent work, and I get to talk about work that, well, first of all, that I know very little about. So hopefully no too hard questions on some of this, but represent work that really goes beyond just my narrow program, which if you've worked in government before, not everybody gets the opportunity to do that, and it's wonderful. So for example, in the Office of Science, which funds some of, it's a $6 billion basic science research agency funding science across physics, biology, chemistry. They do a significant amount of work in terrestrial and atmospheric Earth modeling in order to predict, improve the predictive accuracy of the terrestrial models. They need to be coupled effectively with ocean models and with the atmospheric models as well. And so DOE is increasingly working with NOAA and with other partners to improve the interfaces between the terrestrial and the aquatic models to improve the predictive accuracy of both. And that's not something we can do by ourselves. That's something that we need to begin to share information and receive information and often work jointly with other agencies doing, that are predominantly, whose predominant mandate is in the ocean space. Other organizations within energy efficiency and renewable energy that maybe you wouldn't have thought of, our biofuels office does a substantial amount of work looking at the potential for producing biofuels and biodiesel from macroalgae in the ocean. Likewise, our fuel cells office, which has focused historically on hydrogen-powered cars, is increasingly looking at technologies to facilitate electrolysis at sea and also to facilitate electrolysis using seawater as the primary working fluid. And then, of course, our offshore wind office, which does a lot of work with a number of the folks up here, focused traditionally on on traditional mechanical and electrical R&D, things like improving aerodynamic efficiency of blades, new manufacturing techniques for some of the larger towers that you see where on-site manufacturing is really important. But they also do a lot of atmospheric research. You can imagine why, understanding turbulence and wake effects, for example, to help the siting of individual turbines within a field. And also a lot of environmental research to understand the potential impacts of both on aquatic and avian life for offshore wind turbines, obviously for onshore wind turbines for avian life as well. And our offshore wind division just released last year, awarded an $18.5 million grant to NYSERDA, the New York State Research and Development Agency, to lead an offshore wind consortium managing all of the or a significant portion of the industry-focused offshore wind research in the US. So back to marine energy, though, and what my office does. And this is where I'll talk a little bit about this dual role. Part is very similar and parallels what we do in offshore wind. So a lot of, again, mechanical and electrical engineering research to improve the performance, reduce the cost of wave power and tidal power, and particularly things like wave power. It's actually a fundamentally different paradigm for energy generation than anything else that exists. Instead of sort of a fluid moving straight through a turbine, or PV, which is also different but relatively straightforward. Waves, if you imagine getting energy from waves, there's 6 degrees of freedom of motion that you have to capture it from, and it's a very slow moving but very energy dense fluid. And so everything from your physical structures to your power takeoff converters have to be completely different, completely reimagined. Plus then they have to work work at sea and be effectively marinized. So that's a big chunk of work we do. But similarly, we also do a lot of work on environmental science, a lot of work also characterizing different oceanic resource states, so different wave climates, and being able to make meaningful differences and predictions of both near term and farther out of wave climates in different parts of the country, and based on different specific physical drivers of the wave climate. The flip side, though, that we're starting to work on, and this comes back to the Powering the Blue Economy report that Tommy mentioned, is recognizing that while a lot of the work that we've done in the past has been focused on really these large-scale wave or tidal devices, like what you've seen gone in the water in Europe, for example, again, paralleling offshore wind, there's a potentially very important niche powering technologies, providing energy, persistent energy for technologies that are emerging and increasing in their technology sort of maturity level and in their use at sea. And that's everything from deep water aquaculture, which if you listen to the World Bank, they say needs to expand by a couple orders of magnitude just in order to feed the world's population by 2050. Or ocean observation, which is something that we've, is I think probably near and dear to a lot of people in this room. Technologies that can improve our ability to collect very energy dense data, stay out for longer, and have larger data sets and different types of data. So looking at the energy constraints that some of these industries face and how marine energy, typically designed very differently, small integrated systems. If you imagine an active acoustic buoy, for example, or an active ocean monitoring buoy that's integrated with wave energy conversion device, you save significant money on the wave energy hardware, but then you dramatically and most cost effectively increase the energy capacity of the monitoring systems at sea. So we released the Powering the Blue Economy report. It looks at 8 different potential applications like this within the blue economy, divided into 2 major sectors. One is power at sea, we call, and that's aquaculture, ocean observation, potential mineral harvesting, which is a little bit farther off into the future, more likely. And then what we call resilient coastal communities, which is looking at applications like desalination, for example, where you can reduce or avoid the single biggest expense of desalination, which is the electricity consumption, by just mechanically pumping the water directly using a wave energy converter through the RO membrane. Also looking at powering remote off-grid communities where we actually have a number of projects where relatively few other resources are available and existing, the electricity, the existing resource is usually $1.50 kilowatt hour diesel. So lastly, this isn't just conceptual that we're talking about. We're actually moving forward with funding opportunities because that's part of what DOE does is funds research through our national labs. But the other part of what we do is we offer competitively awarded grants or cooperative agreements to private sector and academic institutions for funding. The first opportunity is a prize that we announced in February at the Oceanology Conference in San Diego. And we hope to launch, knock on wood, next week. Looking at modular, easily deployable desalination systems powered by wave energy. The idea is something that you can fit in the back of a pickup truck, operate continuously for multiple days at a time in the ocean with no O&M, take back, and that a community can keep. Understand the installation, the maintenance, the deployment of it, and that can produce fresh water much more cost effectively than shipping in bottles or through solar. And the other major area that's likely to come up, we don't have a specific opportunity on the streets yet, but that we are increasingly working with NOAA and with our colleagues at ONR and with BOEM as well, is looking at marine energy for ocean observations and for powering charging stations for UUVs. In the work that we've done, this is probably the area that got by far the most interest from the stakeholders that we talked to and worked with. The story that I tell most frequently is talking to somebody from Saab who's working on a UUV charging station, and I asked him what he would do, what he would be able to do if he were able to power it remotely at sea without ever having to come back to shore. And he said, well, that's easy, I'd retire. So there is a demand that's out there. And then the last thing I'll say, just for all of the work that we do, environmental sustainability is paramount. None of this works if it's more damaging to the aquatic ecosystem than it is beneficial. And I think we say that because that's the reason most of us got into renewable energy to start with. But also from a very practical perspective, the permitting process is at such that if you can't demonstrate that you are an environmental net plus, you're not likely to be able to go in the water in the first place. And so we do a tremendous amount of research, both looking at potential environmental effects of of wave energy, everything from direct fish strike and marine mammal strike to sediment transport and habitat effect to electromagnetic fields to acoustic effects in construction and during operation. And we also develop new monitoring technologies that facilitate additional data collection. These are specifically designed for monitoring energy systems in the ocean, but they can be used for anything. So I'll leave it at that. Just say that the reason we're here is because we can't do any of this without talking to you. You are the primary ocean stakeholders. Part of what we are trying to do is make your jobs easier. If we don't know what your job is, if we're not talking to you every day, know what you need, we're not going to be able to design our technologies appropriately. So look forward to continuing a dialogue with everybody here.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks so much, Director Moreno. Nancy, would you like to take it from there?
Do you mind if I stand?
No, absolutely.
Great. All right, thanks, Alejandro, and thank you, Tommy. I want to call you Director Boudreau, but that's a couple lifetimes ago. Hi, everyone. I'm Nancy Sopko. Like Tommy said, I'm the co-director of the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, which is an independent philanthropy-funded project out of the University of Delaware. We are in existence to advance and build the case for offshore wind energy in the United States. And we provide expertise and analysis, information sharing, and strategic partnerships with all levels of government, with advocacy organizations, and with the offshore wind industry. All right, so what's so great about offshore wind? Well, a lot, actually. So offshore wind blows the strongest where it's needed most, near the largest population centers in the nation. Mostly those population centers are on the East Coast, but we also see that on the West Coast. And so the coasts are where the most of the people are in the country, and that is where the offshore wind resources are the best. There's also an incredible job creation opportunity in offshore wind. Tim Charters will speak to this a little later, I'm sure, but we find really great synergies with the oil and gas industry, especially the oil and gas supply chain. These are skilled workers who know how to work in the open ocean developing energy. And so we can draw on a lot of those skills and a lot of those expertise to help build offshore wind. And in fact, that is already happening. The first offshore wind farm in the country, the Block Island Wind Farm, already used at least 2 companies from the Gulf to weld together the foundations for the turbines and to transport those turbines up the coast to Rhode Island. So it's an incredible job creation opportunity that we like to see more of. It's clean, it's homegrown, and it will increase our energy security as a nation. We can also lock in prices for about 20, 25 years and know that that price is going to stay that way for the next 20, 25 years. All right, so where is the activity? As I said, it's on the coasts. Both coasts, as you see, are getting in on the game. Maine and Ohio, you see, are highlighted because those are the DOE demonstration projects. So those are pilot projects that are testing new technology. I'm sure Alejandro could say more about that, but we have a 12 megawatt pilot project that is looking to be developed off the coast of Maine with floating wind structures. And in Ohio, we have a project called the Icebreaker Project, slated to be built in Lake Erie. And I think that's about 24 megawatts. So smaller projects, but testing really cool technologies. In Lake Erie, you'll see a suction bucket foundation that doesn't require pile driving into the seabed, but more suctioning to stabilize itself, which would really help in the decommissioning, as well as with the noise levels for the marine environment. And Hawaii and South Carolina are also looking to develop offshore wind off the coast of their states. They have call areas right now, which is a very early stage in the process. Here is a closer look, a deeper dive into the offshore wind activity. And these are all the BOEM lease areas across the nation, mostly focused on the East Coast, as you see. But let's start on the left panel here. The image shows so Vineyard Wind, Equinor, Deepwater Wind, Bay State Wind, Mayflower Wind, and Vineyard Wind. All right, that's a lot. So there are 2 lease areas off the coast of Massachusetts. That's that first Vineyard Wind area and the Bay State Wind project that were up for auction in January of 2015. One of those lease areas, as you see, went to Bay State Wind. That's a joint venture between Ørsted and Eversource. And the other went to Vineyard Wind, which is a joint venture between Avangrid Renewables and the Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. What I want to highlight here is when this auction took place, no one bid on the 2, now 3 big lease areas on the easternmost side of that graphic. Also, when this auction took place in January of 2015, each of the 2 lease areas that went to Vineyard Wind and Bay State Wind, they went for less than $300,000 each. That's significant because let's fast forward to December 2018, almost 4 years later, and now multiple companies, 19 companies to be exact, told BOEM they were interested in bidding on the now 3 lease areas that we see. So that's Equinor, Mayflower Wind, and Vineyard Wind. And each of those lease areas went for $135 million. So competition is really, really heating up. Mayflower is also, just to point out, a joint venture between EDP Renewables and Shell. The middle panel here shows the lease areas in the Mid-Atlantic. You see Equinor has that lease area off the coast of New York. That was the previous record for a lease auction a couple years ago. That lease area went for $42.5 million. And we hadn't seen anything like that before that. So that was record-shattering at the time. Those purple areas off the coast of New York and New Jersey are call areas. We are looking to BOEM to issue the final wind energy areas on them in the next couple of days, honestly, sooner the better. And that EDF area off the coast of New Jersey is actually should read Atlantic Shores, which is a joint venture between Shell and EDF Renewables. And then the right panel, as you see, are additional areas off the coast of North Carolina and South Carolina. So there's a lot going on in the offshore wind industry, and there has been for a couple of years now. So I thought the best way to kind of put this together for you were to capture the headlines from a lot of these milestones that have been reached over the past couple of years. So it all starts, well, it doesn't all start, and Tommy can probably say this, with the Block Island Wind Farm. Many, many, many years of preparation happened before the Block Island Wind Farm came online in December of 2016, but we'll be able to see through a couple more slides that momentum has really taken off since that first wind farm came online in America in 2016. A couple of years later, we saw the big Massachusetts solicitation get awarded to Vineyard Wind for 800 megawatts. What does that mean? That means that Massachusetts said, we are looking to buy 400 to 800 megawatts of offshore wind power through our first solicitation. And we want to reach out to you, developers in the offshore wind industry, and ask who wants to provide us with that power. And we will accept your applications, we will consider them, and then we will award a winner. Well, Vineyard Wind won that first solicitation in Massachusetts in May of 2018, and that was for 800 megawatts. That very same day, Rhode Island selected Deepwater Wind, now Ørsted, to build a 400 megawatt offshore wind farm and provide that power to Rhode Island. And then just a few weeks later, Connecticut was announced that it would procure 200 megawatts of offshore wind from Deepwater Wind's Revolution Wind project. And so we see here, just to put this in context, In less than a month, from May 23rd to June 13th, we have 3 states announcing that they will buy 1.4 gigawatts of offshore wind energy. And that is important because right now, in 2019, Denmark, the first country in the world to develop offshore wind, has less than 1.4 gigawatts of offshore wind installed. So this is a big deal. And when you have a purchaser for your power, that is a great hurdle that you've just overcome to get that project in the water and spinning and developing clean energy. The last one there, New Jersey approves the largest single state offshore wind solicitation. That was because their solicitation was for 1,100 megawatts of offshore wind energy. So here we have November. BOEM outlines the New York Bight and the draft wind energy areas there. Again, those are those purple areas we saw in that previous slide. Again, we are waiting for BOEM to issue those final wind energy areas any day now. And then the biggest news of offshore wind ever in the United States, certainly, and maybe in the world, the record-smashing price for the 3 lease areas in Massachusetts, $405 million. And then, just a couple weeks later, Governor Cuomo said, wait, I have big news too. New York is going to commit to buying 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind energy by 2035. And that is well beyond any other state, even now. It's about 3 times as much energy of any other state's commitment. We also see California getting into the game with floating wind, and at the bottom there you'll see Connecticut. The House in Connecticut State Legislature voted unanimously. There's actually breaking news on that today, but that bill calls for the state to procure 2,000 megawatts of offshore wind. So big numbers coming out of Connecticut. And then the last slide on this, just last week, Newsday, a newspaper out of New York, reported that the state would be announcing the winner of their first offshore wind solicitation last week. So we are anxiously awaiting that any day now. And also last week, Rhode Island regulators approved the 400 megawatt power purchase agreement for the Revolution Wind project. And then Virginia is getting into the game. And then this week, just 2 days ago, big news out of Massachusetts that they are doubling their commitment to buying offshore wind from 1,600 megawatts to 3,200 megawatts. And then at the bottom there, the big news of the day, Bloomberg reports that the Connecticut State Senate voted last night to raise the state's procurement goal to 2,000 megawatts. So that is huge news coming out of the states and the federal government advancing offshore wind. So we see there's a lot of excitement in the industry, there's a lot of momentum, there's a lot of progress being made in such a short amount of time, but it's not all sunshine and rainbows. We do have some challenges. And one of the biggest challenges facing the offshore wind industry is its relationship with the fishing community. The fishing community is a very important industry in the United States. It is decades, if not hundreds of years old, and it is very important for us to get this right. So while we sit in a time that is seeing a lot of progress, there are, as with all new industries, some challenges. But like some challenges, this challenge brings with it a whole lot of opportunity. And so there are many efforts that are underway right now, certainly within the 2 industries, to improve the relationship between offshore wind and the commercial fishing industry. Two efforts that I am particularly close to are the offshore wind standards and the public participation guide. So I'll briefly get into it, and then we'll talk more during the question and answer session. But the offshore wind industry standards, the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind and AWEA, the American Wind Energy Association, teamed up to develop principles that the offshore wind developers would adhere to when engaging with fishermen. We have spent many, many months in conversations with the various developers to get a work product that is both meaningful to the fishermen and allows some room for individual developers to make their own business decisions. And these principles are really the floor below which the industry agrees it will not go. The developers are working every day, and they're going above and beyond these set of principles. But we wanted to find some commonalities that would be standards that the industry can hold themselves to. And so I'm happy to report that we have reached consensus on these list of principles, this set of a dozen or so principles that again, the offshore wind developers agreed to abide by when engaging with the fishermen. And so the next step on that is to take that to the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance, ask them, are these principles meaningful to your membership, the fishermen in your membership, and how can we make them better? So a lot of effort underway on improving communications. The other effort I wanted to highlight is that the Special Initiative is spearheading with the American Wind Energy Association the development of a public participation guide. So through our many meetings with policymakers, especially on the Hill, and with our talks with the Responsible Offshore Development Alliance, RODA, we heard that the BOEM regulatory process is very overwhelming, it's very complicated, it needs to be much more user-friendly. And so we joined forces to develop a guide, a trifold, that puts the BOEM regulatory process, the timeline for everything that needs to get done in order to get an offshore wind project permitted and developed in a very user-friendly way. And so we are working to put that participation guide together, and then we will kind of ground truth it with some policymakers and with RODA and others, especially in the industry, to see, are we getting it right? Because it's going to be around for a long time. And then a couple things to mention there, just to note that there are a lot of multiple efforts underway between the two industries to come together and collaborate on a lot of things. So RODA's Joint Industry Task Force is where they're trying to maximize compatibility between the two industries. ROSA is a collaborative effort between the fishing community, offshore wind industries, and state and federal governments to advance regional research and monitoring of fish and offshore wind. And of course, there are specific efforts underway with each developer trying to meet with specific fishermen in their region around their projects. So we think that if we get it right, we'll be able to see a lot more of these. And that's it.
That was terrific. Thanks so much, Nancy. A lot of potential megawatts out there. How do we get that on the grid? Kevin.
I have some answers, Tommy. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm going to build on Nancy's excellent foundation of what's happening in the offshore wind sphere. Maybe just to start by saying a word about Emberic, the company that I'm working with, is a renewable energy transmission developer, has another business line around smart grids and smart energy campuses. But it's a company that there aren't a lot of so-called merchant transmission developers in this country, or independent transmission developers. Emberic is one of them and has successfully co-developed a couple very significant transmission projects, bringing clean electrons from northern New Jersey, the Neptune project over to central Long Island, the Hudson project over to Midtown Manhattan. Both projects were done on time, on budget. Both buried the cable its entire length under the seabed and under the ground on Earth, and under the ground terrestrially. As Tommy noted, my career has been in the NGO world and in government, and really coming out of the Department of Energy, I was really convinced that that the private sector and the clean tech sector really has a big role now in accelerating the deployment of clean energy and helping to bend that carbon curve down. And so I'm delighted to be with this company. Every day is a tutorial, not just because it's the private sector, which is a whole new world for me, but it's the electricity grid, which is about as arcane and complicated as it comes. You might have heard Nancy mentioned the New York Phase 1 offshore wind procurement, and Barrick has partnered with Vineyard Wind, the winner of the 800 megawatt project in Massachusetts, to put in one of the 4 bids into the New York procurement that we're awaiting word from Governor Cuomo, who as to which bids have won. And the Vineyard Wind and Barrick bid, called Liberty Wind, is the largest of the bids, 1,200 megawatts, and it will bring it'll bring that energy down from their second lease area, the $135 million purchase by Vineyard Wind off of Massachusetts, 170 miles down through the sea, under the seabed, to central Long Island, landing at Jones Beach, coming 50 feet under the beach, and then working its way 17 miles up to the Rulin Road substation. So I guess the most noteworthy thing I want to say right now is what a remarkable moment, in that I think many of us feel that we're losing the fight to slow the pace of climate change, and that we're really running out of time, and that we really need to accelerate everything we can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from every sector and every source. And so we're turning to the oceans, among other places, to help generate that clean energy that can help us accelerate the retirement of coal and natural gas plants, and to electrify the economy in a clean way. At the very moment, the oceans are under terrific stress, in great part because of climate change. And everybody here knows this. Ocean acidification, warming, increasing storm surges, flooding. And as we talk about what are very ambitious goals in the offshore wind sphere, it's a normal reaction to say, you know, what the heck, you know, we're going to add yet another pressure to the ocean. And so it's a remarkable moment for all of those reasons, but also because offshore wind is a brand new domestic sector. Hasn't existed before. The 5 European countries have been at it since 1991 and have a lot of experience, primarily in the North Sea. But it's brand new here, which means we can plan this out. We can think it through and plan it and implement this new clean energy in a way that minimizes impacts. You know, I say this is a big new industry coming. Just to add to what Nancy has said, if you add up the targets that the respective governors and state legislatures up and down the eastern seaboard have declared, are the targets for offshore wind, you get to 22 gigawatts, 22,000 megawatts. And to put that into perspective, your average nuclear reactor is 1,000, maybe 1,200 megawatts. So we're talking something on the order of 20, the equivalent of 20 new nuclear reactors in energy off of our coast. And that's just as of today. And we understand the capacity, the potential is greater than that. And roughly 2,000, or maybe specifically 2,040 megawatts have actually been awarded or procured. So it's interesting because here I am in the private sector working for a company, but because it's a brand new sector, we found ourselves right in the thick of the public policy debate. And as a transmission developer, we are making the case that we ought to be planning an offshore wind transmission grid that's open access, like we have on shore, where transmission and generation are separated so that there's separate ownership, which has been the case on the onshore electric grid for decades through FERC policy and through the statutes and jurisprudence. And that has not been the choice of the big European wind developers coming over. They're making the case to the policymakers here that they should be able to bundle transmission and generation and design, build, finance, and own both. So we're a little bit of a disruptor in that space, but for good reason. We think that, as FERC has long thought on shore, you want to separate those so there's no monopolistic temptations to charge your competitor higher price to get on or to block them out entirely. There are those issues. But also, there are only so many existing electrical substations on shore that can handle the kinds of injections of offshore wind that we're talking about. 400, 800, 1,200 megawatts coming to shore without very costly and expensive upgrades. And if we do it in a way that each wind farm runs their own cable to shore, they call it a direct gen lead line, the prospects are high that the early wind farms will pick off the best points of access. They'll probably underutilize those substations. There's only so many times those fragile coastal ecosystems or the host community, onshore communities are going to allow digging up to run those cables. And yet, we didn't, and we weren't the only voice in this space, but there weren't a lot of voices. We didn't win the day for the first round of procurements in Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey, where it was decided that the only eligible bidders were those who held a wind energy area lease, and those are wind developers, and that they could basically build and own both transmission and generation. The procurements have allowed and maybe even encouraged those developers to partner with transmission developers, and that led to our participation in phase one. We feel like we've made some real progress on that argument, though, in phase two. So Governor Cuomo, in his State of the State address at the end of January, when he boosted the New York target from 2,400 to 9,000 megawatts, in that same announcement, he directed his team to start thinking about a planned transmission grid. And when I say that, we're talking about, you can imagine putting some collector stations offshore, 30 miles offshore, adjacent to some of these wind energy area leases, where multiple wind farms can plug in and you run fewer cables to shore, but with greater capacity. And similarly on shore, you think carefully about where you want that energy, where are the load centers, what do the grid operators want to do with it. So let me stop there. There are a lot of advantages to this that are related to a more efficient and affordable electricity grid, one that's more resilient, more redundant, and so on. But from a marine situation, you imagine you're disrupting the floor bed fewer times, you're running fewer cables, you're concentrating the infrastructure. So from both protecting the marine ecosystem, endangered marine species, and the commercial and recreational fisheries, we would argue it's a real plus. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Kevin. And all of these are individual pieces of the puzzle, and I think what your talk helped us do is think about the opportunities as well as some of the challenges in a more integrated way, and appreciate that. Next, I'd like to hear about from you, Tim, based on your experience. You've worked with, well, NOIA is a special organization that's near and dear to my heart because it focuses on offshore energy development regardless of source, which was very similar to my former agency, BOEM. And so I think you bring some very valuable perspective on all of these issues as well. So thank you very much for joining.
Well, thanks for having me here. I really appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, so for 45 years, NOIA has served as the offshore energy association. We represent about 250 companies, and for obviously the first 35 to 40 years of that time, we spent a focus on oil and gas industry in the United States. We are only domestic. Over the last, and I say 5 years, but really it's been almost more like 10, we've increasingly focused on wind as well. And when we talk about focusing on wind, it's because it's very easy for companies that do business in the offshore space to do more business in the offshore space in the same place. And as Nancy mentioned, 2 of our companies helped build Block Island, Gulf Island Fabrication, who built the foundations, and Modco, who's now Falcon Global, who moved them around and brought them up for installation. Our companies, 20% of our companies are what you think of as oil and gas companies, the big folks who actually produce, but 80% of the companies in our association are those service companies. It's everybody from helicopter operators and crew boat work folks and cable laying companies and Barrick, who's a member company of ours. And it's a whole raft of folks who make the offshore energy space come to play. And obviously, when Nancy, who we partner with, comes out with a report that says there's $70 billion in economic opportunity by 2030, all of my companies say, well, gee, what piece of that is going to be ours, right? And they are absolutely interested, and they see how these pieces come together. And again, Nancy's report, and I keep saying Nancy's, it was really just SIOW, but I'll keep saying Nancy's because it's really awesome. The reality is, when they say 1,700 foundations, right? My companies who build foundations say to themselves, okay, I can sign a contract for 1,700 tomorrow if somebody will give me a place to sign the pin, right? And we're excited about this opportunity. My folks at our annual meetings, the Renewables Committee meeting, which has always had some great speakers, is the best attended. It gets the most questions. It is an area where folks are very interested in seeing and learning more on how to be engaged. That's not to say that it isn't an area that has challenges. And Nancy mentioned the fishing one. I would mention there's a couple other challenges as this process moves forward that we have to overcome. One is actually getting leases in the ocean and getting things built. We have had a long leasing program out of BOEM as we move through things, and as we now move to start doing construction, the construction plans have taken longer than we think we had hoped to see them come into place. And some of those challenges have been, standard working in the ocean. It's standard understanding of fishermen's needs and demands and how to accommodate them. But as we start actually seeing projects move out, in Dominion or Vineyard, I think, are racing to see who's going to be first for the real project in the ocean, we still have to look forward to more leasing activity as we go into this process. And I say that because we've got a lot of great areas, we've got some places to build, but if we don't have a continued look at where we're going to build the next project down the road, and Nancy mentioned New York Bight, and we're sure hoping that BOEM will come out with an announcement, but after New York Bight, where are we going to go, right? There's an awful lot of area off of Maine that looks really attractive. I mean, it has a really great resource. It has great ocean opportunities. BOEM hasn't talked about moving out that direction in any real fungible way. Do we look to North Carolina? Do we do more leases off of Virginia? Where is this going to continue? And the reason I say that is because as the folks in the supply chain, right, when you look at the Northeast and you say, okay, I've got to build a couple $100 million facility to work out of the port of New London or New Bedford or somewhere along the coast, you need to know that you're going to have a consistent stream of work over the next years to do this. And if BOEM doesn't keep leasing in a regular process, if we don't keep the construction pipeline sort of filled, it's hard to make that investment, right? It's hard to say I'm going to put all of this money in knowing that in 2027 or 2028 I might have to take 2 years off and lay everybody off for a couple of years because I'm not going to have enough work. And so seeing BOEM come up with a steady sort of leasing agenda and a program and a plan that they actually are going to commit to making sure that we get this stuff rolling has been an important process for us. The other one is DOD, and Nancy didn't mention this, but the biggest problem, and I think in a lot of ways, is convincing the Department of Defense that they have to come up with a way to share the ocean, right? We as an industry in the offshore wind space have conceded the view shed from the beaches, right? And I say that because we've made the decision, I think, since Cape Wind was so much fun. We've made the decision that we're going to yield the view shed entirely, right? We're going to start 15 miles off with pretty much the closest, and really we're looking 25 to 35 off. And so in doing that, we've seeded a giant resource, right? The most affordable resource, right? Because it's cheaper to bring it ashore, it's cheaper to construct it in smaller spaces. We've sort of yielded that great resource to the view shed, and we moved further out, right? And moving further out, we've created another set of problems. We've got more conflicts with DOD, right? And on New York Bight, it was DOD training areas, right? And in the DOD training areas, we're now in conflict. And convincing DOD that it's a big ocean and we have to share it, right? That's something that we're all working on, and I think next week in Congress, you're going to see some more efforts on convincing DOD that we actually mean we want to figure out ways to share the ocean. And it's really important. Two other things on the wind side I'll mention real quick. U.S. territories. We have been working very hard. If you're not aware, the U.S. territories of the United States, Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, and the others. I know them, I'll just spare y'all being listing them all. But they're not covered by the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. And it's something that just, frankly, is an oversight of the law when it was drafted. There have been multiple efforts to try and do this over the last few years. I did it at the committee and actually had the subpoena to the Obama administration, and we still couldn't seem to figure out how to make it happen. This year, I actually believe it's going to happen. There's a Gonzalez bill in the House and a Cassidy-Schatz bill in the Senate that have actually had both hearings and have started moving through committees. We're actually hoping to see that done. But we think it's a tremendous opportunity to bring offshore wind to the U.S. territories, folks who desperately need cheaper and more affordable energy opportunities. For you, as you don't know, Guam and Northern Marianas, they burn heavy fuel oil for electricity. It's really probably the worst choice you could actually make for energy production in the scheme of the world. And so we're really hoping to see that happen. And then the only other thing I'd mention is as we talk about the fishing dynamic and as we talk about offshore wind, one of the things, and I keep pitching this every time I sit before folks talk about, particularly if there's so many scientists in the crowd, I keep pitching there's a generational scientific opportunity as we put wind into the ocean in the Atlantic, right? You have the opportunity to develop a program that will look at the impacts of this industry on the ocean from the zero, nothing out there, to what will become a 22 gigawatt by 2030 and a 50 gigawatt by 2050 industry, right? You have a chance to look at this in a sort of a generational scale. And at the end of the day, right, when these turbines' lives are expired, right, in the oil and gas industry, we've done rigs to reefs. I haven't copyrighted it yet, but so don't stick it on T-shirts. But I keep saying we need to talk about a Blades to Bounty program, right? We need to talk about in the Atlantic, which does not have a lot of seafloor infrastructure, right? What are we going to do with these foundations and these towers and these blades at the end of their lives? Are we going to, they're going to build up a shell mound around them, right? That's what's going to happen because that's what happens in the ocean space, right? Are we going to convert them into a program like Rigs to Reefs where we're going to leave them in place and we're going to start building structure in the Atlantic like we have in the Gulf of Mexico with this sort of stuff? Or are we going to go back to we really want the Atlantic to be a flat bottom, we're going to take everything out and we're going to do like the Europeans have, which is we're going to go through with a trawler and we're going to strip out all those shell mounds, we're going to strip out all of that subsea structure, we're going to strip everything out to the bottom. That's a decision that a lot of folks in BOEM is working on making some of those decisions. But in the decommissioning side of this, again, scientific research opportunity to see what are the real benefits of this stuff as we put it into the ocean. And then knowing that we're running really short on time, I'm going to be really quick on the oil and gas side because I realize, the crowd, but as the oil and gas guy up here, I'm obligated. Listen, the president put out a 5-year plan, and listen, it was as exciting and as big and as controversial as you can imagine. This president putting out a plan that would do that. But for the first time in a generation, we're looking at the resources in places outside of the Gulf of Mexico. When we talk about the Atlantic and the opportunities for shooting seismic and getting some scientific understanding of what are the resources that may be out there, right? It's critically important that we get the opportunity to do that. And we've shot seismic for generations in the Gulf of Mexico. We can shoot seismic safely off the coast of the Atlantic. It's important for us to understand the dynamic of the resources that are out there. And I say this because we as a nation, we've developed a lot of oil onshore, right? And it's really amazing what 6 guys with a pickup truck can do to drill a hole in the Permian Basin and produce 1,500 barrels, a day or 1,000 barrels a day out of a hole. That's really, it's amazing what we've done onshore. offshore, we build generational level facilities, right? We build $8 billion platforms that produce 125 to 250,000 barrels of oil a day, and it produces them for generations. And I know for a lot of folks in the room that sounds really scary, but let's keep in mind, we as a nation, while we are producing a lot more oil, we still have massive regional dependence, right? And I say this, and I'll use one example for this. One place is Boston Harbor, which imports natural gas from Russia. And if you're not familiar with it, the Boston Globe has done a number of great editorials on it. I encourage you to look them up. But they're dependent on Russia for gas. If you know where that Russian gas is from, it's the Sea of Orb. And if you want to see irresponsible oil and gas development, you want to see how it should not be done, you want to see, particularly in an Arctic atmosphere, look at the Google pictures, right? Look it up and see where this oil is coming from, because that's the oil and gas that we're using. It's the natural gas that Boston is using every winter right now, and it's not produced here. It's produced in Russia, and it's produced in conditions that we would never produce here in the United States. And the second one is California, which I think a lot of folks, and again, I know the crowd here, so I'll be clear. California, I know a lot of folks think California is a great model for the way the United States is going. On the oil side, California is a really amazing dynamic. California's oil demand has been growing. It is not just growing, its foreign demand is growing faster because its domestic production and the imports it gets from Alaska are falling off. As of today, California gets about 57% of its oil from foreign places. Primarily that's Saudi Arabia, which was 134 million barrels last year. They gave them $10 billion, which made Saudi Aramco the richest company on earth. The other dynamic is that they get it from Colombia and Ecuador, which Ecuador, it's a lot of Chinese companies drilling, which again, if you want to talk about environmental standards. But the trick is we have resources here that we can use and we can develop and we can displace that foreign dependence, which we still have on a regional basis in a lot of ways. And we can do it in the most responsible system possible. And so I think when we talk about generationally managing and powering our future, oil and gas is still going to be there for a long time to come. We can do it here cleaner, better, and more responsibly with a smaller carbon footprint than just about anybody else on the planet. And so there you go. That's my last pitch. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Tim. This is tremendous presentations, each of you. Thanks so much. And I really appreciate the amount of thought and perspective that went into each of them. It really came through. We've got a lot of great questions from the audience, and I've gone through, and there's definitely some themes that run through it, and they connect with the overall theme of our session, which is looking out at the opportunity for energy offshore, whatever the source, whether it's traditional oil and gas development or emerging wind energy that's becoming more real all the time, or these technologies that are in the research and development phase but have enormous potential. One of the challenges, and Director Moreno, I thought, articulated it extremely well, is everyone here, while looking to that opportunity and seeing that opportunity and feeling the urgency around it due to climate change and other concerns, no one in this room is in the business of harming the ocean and wants to be in that business. And there is an appreciation and an understanding for the potential for dislocation with well-established industries and activities, including fishing, including tourist beach communities, viewshed from homes, and historic resources. And of course, everyone here appreciates the work that the military does securing our coasts. So Nancy, you touched on all of the years of hard work that have gone into establishing some principles about trying to resolve these conflicts. And BOEM, we kind of under Secretary Salazar branded it as smart from the start, right? That's how we got citing the way we did. I always thought it was like super clever because it rhymed and was alliterative. And but the idea was to deconflict and try to resolve some of these issues early. And so can you talk about some of those principles that you've been working on how to engage stakeholders and what some of the principles are, and providing some reassurance and genuine engagement with all of those communities, including fishing interests?
Sure. So when we were talking about putting these principles together, we first had to understand what the major concerns were from the commercial fishing industry. So we did some research, we did some looking into the media and the different articles that have come out on this issue. And we did some asking around, specifically with the offshore wind developers and what they were hearing on the ground. And we realized that there were probably 6 main concerns from the fishing community, and they center on participation. So not feeling like they're a part of the process of developing offshore wind. Navigation, so how their boats would navigate through a offshore wind project, if at all. Sound, of course, so how the sound of pile driving and development in general is going to impact the fish in the area, and are they going to send those fish away? So it's displacement. Did I say displacement? Displacement, which is, of course, the fish swimming away, but also will the fishermen also have to leave that area because there's an offshore wind farm there. Ecosystem, which is another, so you're looking at the cumulative impacts to the ecosystem, how that affects the fish in the area, and gear loss, which is a big thing for the fishermen, especially the commercial fishermen. And so we wanted to address all 6 of those concerns. Most of the principles are overlapping multiple concerns, so we try to address multiple concerns in one principle and others. I don't have them off the top of my head, but there are a dozen of them that are specifically focused on addressing those 6 major concerns of the fishermen. And so the next step, as I mentioned, is to ground truth them and go to ROTA and say, okay, is this really, are these principles really getting to the heart of your membership's concerns with offshore wind development, and how can we make them better and stronger, more meaningful, and how can we collaborate better on this?
Thanks very much. And Kevin or Tim, obviously and I am truly thankful for our democratic process, as challenging as it can be. It is the best system for surfacing and resolving problems and issues. And one outlet for all of that potentially is political. And both of you in your different capacities have had to deal with sort of the political and policy issues. Do you have any observations with respect to offshore wind in particular on political challenges and approaches to whether at the federal level or the state level that may be effective through political processes?
Well, I said it a WEA 2 weeks ago that what everybody needs to do is take Nancy's report, roll it up into a roll, and find a politician to slap with it till they pay attention to it. The reality is there's 2 things on the political side that I think are really tough for us. One, as an emerging industry, we don't have a built-in constituency, right? So when you have senators and congressmen from the Northeast, when their constituents come in, their constituents aren't our employees. They're the fishermen and the folks who live on the shore and the tourism guys and the DoD base commander over here. Those are their constituents, right? And so not having a built-in constituent base is a politically challenging dynamic, and it's one of the reasons I think we continue to face hurdles on the congressional side. And 2 weeks ago, there was DoD probes, there was language put in which essentially said, hey, take a time out, we need another year for DoD to study this stuff, and you bang your head against the desk and you're reminded that, okay, we've got to go back and remind them that a year timeout doesn't work for a whole host of folks who have deadlines to meet for power purchase agreements, who have contracts on the line, who are working actually to start building stuff. But the reality is the political challenge. Until we get an industry building and we have a constituent base, I think we have a lot of work to continue to overcome in that place. And again, reports like $70 billion, we're going to build stuff. And when you take this and when we go to work, when you go meet with the labor union guys, and next week on Natural Resources, they're hearing on workforce, where Nancy's partner, co-director is testifying. a bill that we're in support of. It's a Keating bill, and we're supportive of it. But when you start talking about here's the job order, here's what's actually coming, here's what's really going to be there, you can get over those hurdles. But in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. And unfortunately, we spend a lot of time explaining after getting smacked. And so we still have hurdles on that side. And when we have constituents on the ground who are actually building things, it'll be better.
I guess what I would add is, to Tim's excellent point, is, a lot of us live at the intersection between politics and policy. You can't create policy unless you get your politics right. And I would argue politics exists to create policy, to be responsive, to solve problems, be responsive to one's constituents' concerns. And this industry is so new, a lot of the policy is playing catch-up. Now, some of it's in place. Tommy created, with his team, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to think through the federal responsibilities for offshore wind, as well as oil, gas, and so on. That was a policy infrastructure that we're benefiting from today. If you look at the RTOs, the ISOs, the regional transmission organizations that are responsible for overseeing the grid, managing the grid, they're governed by something called the tariff, their governing document, and those tariffs never envisioned offshore wind. So I'm not sure I'd call that politics with a capital P, but maybe with a small p, and that's definitely policy. We're engaging, as are all the wind developers, the regional transmission organizations, to help them, to ask them to start to formulate policy that reflects these goals. And then the last thing I wanted to say, adding to what Nancy was saying, is, again, this is all new, but that means it's a tremendous opportunity to kind of work these issues through. Vineyard Wind, our partner on Liberty Wind, but working off of its award up in Massachusetts to build the 800-megawatt wind farm, sat down with NRDC, the Conservation Law Foundation, and the National Wildlife Federation to work up an agreement to protect the northern right whale, the endangered right whale, during construction and operation. And basically, Vineyard agreed up front, before they've put a single platform or turbine in the ocean, to not conduct construction during the winter and early spring, and to take exceptional measures to reduce noise. And I think that's a great example of what's ahead of us. We need to work all these things through, and I think there's a lot of goodwill across, certainly, the industry that I'm part of.
Yeah. So we have time, I think, for one final question, and Director Moreno, give you the final word. There are, in addition to traditional sources and now offshore wind on the scene, there are a lot of really exciting emerging technologies. In your view, what are some of the biggest hurdles to developing those technologies and in the future realizing commercial application in order to help address all of these problems we've talked about in terms of a clean energy source and minimizing impacts to ocean and marine environments in as advantageous a way as possible?
Sure. For ocean energy, it's a lot of the same, or ocean renewables, it's a lot of the same challenges that you heard here about offshore wind. Certainly the permitting process, the transmission process, they're all very similar. The technology challenges are a bit more challenging, shall we say, in the generation from wind power is now very, very well established, and at least the basic principles of the technology are well understood. Obviously, when you go offshore, there are some physics challenges in addition, but it's not an entirely new paradigm, at least unless you're talking about offshore. So for wave power, for example, the challenges are still primarily technological. That said, I mean, listening to the conversation right now, I was really struck by something we've seen where where marine energy really has had the greatest amount of success to date, and particularly large-scale tidal installations, has been in Europe. And it's the opposite situation there where it's being driven by politics, not by the technology is trying to catch up. But if you go to marine energy conferences, or you look at the few auctions that they've had, it's being driven exclusively by the political desires of regional politicians. So in Ireland, in Scotland, in Wales, in northwestern France and Brittany, and in Normandy, in northern Spain. And it's purely an economic development in sort of, I don't want to say failing coastal areas, but coastal cities that have certainly seen better times, and they see this as a very, very important means to revitalize the ports, the shipbuilding industries. And we've seen this a little bit in the US. The biggest manufacturer of marine energy devices is Vigor in Portland, which is a large shipbuilding company that sees wave power construction as a means, manufacturing rather, as a really important business line. And so, it's interesting, and we don't see even in marine energy that same level of political sort of support in the US, and I'm curious, I'm wondering what the Europeans are doing differently, because certainly if you can get that level of state level or local level political support behind an industry, that goes a long way. And it's, the industry doesn't exist really anymore there, but they see the potential for really meaningful economic development across a wide range of different stakeholders in those communities.
Excellent. Well, thank you, and thanks to each of the members of this panel, and thank you to the audience, and really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Tommy, and thanks everyone on the panel. This was an amazing panel to close out the Capitol Hill Ocean Week 2019 conference. So thank you guys very much. I just want to shout out one more time the appreciation to all of the CHOW sponsors who make this conference possible, and to everyone who's here for their engagement and interest in ocean and Great Lakes issues. So even though the CHOW conference is over, CHOW 2019 isn't over yet. Tomorrow is CHOW Hill Day, and I hope many of you will be joining us for that. It's an important opportunity to take all that you've learned here and go and talk with congressional staff about how important our oceans and Great Lakes issue is, how important renewable energy is. So I'm hoping many people will join us. Just a little bit of a run of the day. So we'll start with a coastal coffee breakfast, and have an opportunity to talk with Hill staff, both on the Senate and House, about the legislative agenda upcoming, especially as it pertains to ocean issues. In the evening, we'll have a nice reception that is being co-hosted by the Oceans Caucus Foundation and the Royal Embassy of Norway to help just celebrate all that we've been able to achieve this week. So before I close, I really want to take time to say a huge thank you to the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation staff, who every year organize CHOW, the gala, and Hill Day. They're really dedicated and hardworking. They put together some really amazing panels and work very hard over this. So I hope you'll join me in thanking them, and also thanking all of the volunteers that give their time to help usher us around and make sure things are working well. So please join me in thanking them.